Okay, so here we go. It's a lecture I'm videotaping for tomorrow's um, 7th period U.S. history class. I'm doing this after school. I just don't have the time to fix it if I screw it up, so hopefully I'll do the best I can and make this coherent anyway. I want you to take notes on this as if I was here in person. What I'm going to do in the next few minutes, I'm going to go through some of the major personalities of the Civil War. I really want you to try to hold on in your memory to what they looked like. I mean, my goal always when I'm trying to teach history is to have vivid images that stay inside your head and not just the words and the concepts. And I think on the Civil War exam, not the one we'll have next week, but later on, the final exam, I'm going to show a handful of these photos, and you're going to need to identify who they are. Okay? So try and pay attention to what they look like, as well as details about what they did and what their position was. So we start with Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy. This guy is a very successful cotton planter from Mississippi, and he was famous for taking really good care of his slaves. I mean, at least compared to the standards of the time. He made sure that they had medical attention. When slaves would get married, he'd provide nice clothes for their, quote, wedding ceremony. Other Southerners kind of laughed at him that he went to the extent of, spending a lot of time and energy and attention on his slaves, but he thought that was the right thing to do. At the same time, when he was a senator from Mississippi in the U.S. Senate, he was one of the most aggressive and eloquent defenders of the entire institution of slavery. In no way did he think that slavery was something to be apologized for. He had a background as an Army officer. He was the commandant of West Point at one point, and he served as the Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce. Secretary of War is what they used to call what we now refer to as the Secretary of Defense. Now, he's selected by the Confederate elite as their president, and he's a very able leader. The guy's smart and intelligent, but he didn't have nearly half of the political skills of Abraham Lincoln. He was pretty much used to just telling people what to do and expecting that they would just do it. All in all, he was not a very efficient or effective manager of the Southern war effort. So that's Jefferson Davis. Now, this is a Union general. His name is George McClellan. And he will be given the command of what will become the main Union Army, what they'll call the Army of the Potomac. The Potomac is the river that's close to Washington, D.C. Now, it's interesting. This guy, he has some ability, and he was given the task of organizing, equipping, and training this big Union Army, the biggest Union Army that the North will have. So that was okay. Now, if he had turned loose the army after he did all this organizing and took some sort of staff position in the War Department or something like that, we probably would have a pretty good opinion of him now. But he is a disaster as a military leader. He's super cautious, and he constantly was overestimating the number of Confederate soldiers that he was facing. He's constantly asking for more supplies, more troops. One analysis that I read is that at heart, after he developed this magnificent army, he just couldn't bear to put it in harm's way to where it would get shot at and destroyed. And that doesn't work too well in war. He was cautious and timid to an extreme, and at the same time, extremely arrogant. He had terrible opinion of Lincoln. He dissed Lincoln behind his back all over the place, once calling him the original guerrilla and a well-meaning baboon. There's a famous story that Lincoln went with his Secretary of State, William Seward, to meet with McClellan at his home in Washington. And so they show up at the door. This is the President of the United States, and they're admitted into the parlor. And McClellan is upstairs, and he basically says in a way that Lincoln could hear, I don't want to see him. Tell him I'm busy. And so the president had to go home because this guy couldn't be bothered to speak with his commander-in-chief. He's in command of the Union Army at the Battle of Antietam, which was almost a major turning point. And I'll cover the Battle of Antietam. In fact, you're gonna start to watch a video, the Ken Burns Civil War video that will cover Antietam, and you'll see what I'm saying about this guy. He lucked into winning this battle, but after he had done it, he just sat back and let Robert E. Lee escape. That could have ended the Civil War right then and there. He had a chance to destroy Lee and his army, and he didn't. After tremendous patience and forbearance, Lincoln finally fired him, and good riddance. This guy probably did as much for the Confederate cause as any one of their own generals. In fact, I forget which one it was, but one Confederate general actually said McClellan brought with him all these huge numbers of troops and supplies and resources to the battle, but he also brought himself, meaning to imply that, that's what saved us. Now, he's not finished after he's fired. He ran against Lincoln in the election of 1864 as a Democrat, as a Northern Democrat, opposed to Lincoln and his anti-slavery policies. He promised that if he wins the election, if he had won the election, that he would immediately start opening up negotiations with the South to try to get them back into the Union. But clearly what he would have done is he would have absolutely told the South, come on back in and nobody's going to mess with the institution of slavery. Because there was a lot of battlefield reverses that happened in the summer of 1864, Lincoln was sure he was going to get beat. But just towards the election, there were a couple of major victories, and it was the Army vote that swung the election in favor of Lincoln and away from McClellan, and Lincoln is elected. Okay, oops. I want you to see the picture. Sorry, I'm messing this up. Okay, this is Ulysses S. Grant. There he is, okay, I just need to be patient. This is the best Northern general, by far. This guy wins the Civil War. An incredible background. He went through West Point. He had his first combat experience during the war with Mexico, served with distinction in that war, was decorated, but he was sent out west. And the thing about Grant is that he really loved his wife, whose name was Julia. They very strong couple, strong marriage, and he just couldn't stand being away from her. And he was in these lonely outposts in the West, including California, which is like the end of the world in those days. And because of boredom and loneliness, he took to drinking too much alcohol. And he did have a problem with alcohol off and on during those years. And he resigned. He was partly pressured into quitting because of the alcohol problem. So he went back east to Illinois and tried to make a go of being a farmer, and the farm failed. He lost it. He tried to open up some other businesses, which all failed. And just as the war breaks out, he's serving as a clerk in a store that his father-in-law owns. So this guy was going nowhere. But as soon as the war starts, because of his West Point background, he's immediately given a colonel command. And his big chance is fairly early in the war when he captures a couple of key Confederate forts on the Mississippi River. After that success, Lincoln eventually appoints him to be in charge of not just the Army of the Potomac, the big Union Army that's fighting in the East, but he puts him in charge of the entire war effort. Lincoln wasn't quite as brilliant a general as his main opponent, Robert E. Lee, but he had one main quality that allows him to succeed. He was relentless. He never gave up. Even after he'd had a reverse or a setback or even a defeat, he just said, all right, that's okay, let's keep going. Attack, attack, attack. And he basically ground down the Confederate army that was facing him. And he's the one that finally cornered Robert E. Lee in Virginia and won the war. He's going to go on to be a president, a two-term president. He's wildly popular after the war. His presidency will not be quite as successful as his time as a general. So that's Ulysses S. Grant. This is the second best Civil War Union general. This is William Tecumseh Sherman. This guy was in charge of a military school that eventually will turn into Louisiana State University, LSU. And when the war breaks out, because he's got West Point background, he's given a command. He didn't do very well for the first year or so, and he got so upset and depressed over the lack of success of his command and his army that he had a nervous breakdown. And he had to go home and basically try to recover for about 2 months in the first year of the war. He pulled himself together, and his luck came when he was assigned to be a supporter to Ulysses S. Grant. Grant recognized that this guy has got real talent and quality. And together they'll become a very, very successful pair. When Grant goes to command the Army of the Potomac, Sherman stays in charge of the western, the Northern Army in the West. And his biggest thing will be when he leads an invasion of his army through the heart of the South. Sherman's march through Georgia is very famous. It's one of the first examples of the concept of total war. In other words, he burned down anything that could be of use in the Confederate war effort, like houses, killed livestock, burned down barns. He wanted to destroy the will and the ability of the Southern civilian population to continue to support the war effort. His most famous quote is, "War is hell." Sherman. All right. Now here is by far the greatest Confederate general. In fact, the most talented military leader on both sides, Robert E. Lee. This guy's a military genius. He comes from an aristocratic family in Virginia. One of his ancestors is Harry Lighthorse Lee, who was part of the Declaration of Independence effort. He signed the Declaration of Independence. So this guy goes to West Point. West Point has this thing called the demerit system. So little things like not having your bed made properly or not having your uniform perfect, you get demerits. He's the only guy in the entire history of West Point to go through the academy without a single demerit. I once had a history teacher at Loyola Marymount describe him as the most perfect American who ever lived. Actually, I don't agree with that. As much as we claim, or Southerners claim, that he was himself against slavery, there was a period of time in his life, a few years before the war, in which he had to take a leave of absence from the army to run his wife's plantation. She inherited it. And while he was there, he really vigorously would pursue runaway slaves. And he wrote very disparagingly about the quality and the character of African American slaves. And when his army at one time was invading the North, and his soldiers were grabbing free black men in Maryland and in Pennsylvania, he turned a blind eye and said, "Oh, that's okay. We're going to grab these guys and re-enslave them into the South." So he's not perfect. But boy, was he an incredibly brilliant tactician. In the first couple of years, this guy was unbeatable. He would just make a laughingstock of the Union armies opposing him. He'd defeat general after general after general, and he seemed invincible. But bad luck caused him to lose the Battle of Antietam, and bad luck plus his own mistakes resulted in his greatest defeat, which was the Battle of Gettysburg. After the Battle of Gettysburg, the South never had the resources to go on the attack anymore, on the offensive. And now he turned to defensive measures. And he proved a master of defense. Despite the massive resources that Ulysses S. Grant had to face him, Robert E. Lee was always able to outmaneuver him or get away, retreat, delay. And the only reason that he finally was cornered and defeated is because his army ran out of resources. They were low on food and everything. And eventually Grant surrounded him, and Lee decided to surrender. The surrender that took place at a small town called Appomattox Courthouse, that's the end of the Civil War. Robert E. Lee. This is the second most successful Southern general, the famous Stonewall Jackson. He got the nickname Stonewall in the very first major battle of the Civil War. His brigade is at one point in the battle, and other Southern troops are retreating. And one of the other commanders, to try and stiffen the resistance of his own troops, said, "Hey, look over there. There's General Jackson. He's standing there like a stone wall." And that stuck. This guy was really eccentric. He had all sorts of bizarre ideas about his health. He'd ride around on his horse with one arm in the air to balance off his humors or something like that. He's deeply religious in a kind of an Old Testament way. One historian calls him a cold-blooded killer. He was a brilliant tactician and really aggressive. And he would have his army march so fast and such long distances to outmaneuver Union forces that they referred to his troops as Jackson's foot cavalry. They'd march like 20, 30 miles in a day, and a lot of these guys didn't even have shoes. He was a main element in some of Lee's most brilliant victories. And just after Lee's greatest triumph, there's the Battle of Chancellorsville is considered to be one of the most perfect battles ever fought in American history in terms of tactics. After the battle was won, he's riding around with his staff, and it's dark, and everybody's nervous. And his own troops, a bunch of picket guards, mistaking him for enemy soldiers, shot at him and his staff, and a bullet nicked his arm. Well, more than nicked his arm, hit his arm, and he died of infection a few days later. This is a big, big loss to the Confederacy, because when I do the analysis of the Battle of Gettysburg, I'll illustrate this better. But the guy that took his place on the opening day of Gettysburg didn't go far enough. There was a chance that if this guy had been really aggressive and attacked and seized the high ground that the Union troops eventually get, the Battle of Gettysburg may have gone a whole different direction. The South could have won it. But this guy wasn't as good as Jackson. If Jackson had still been alive and he'd been in that position, who knows what might have happened. Stonewall Jackson. All right, here's the last one we'll do, and I'll stop. Nathan Bedford Forrest. This guy is amazing. Colorful, violent, aggressive. He's a cavalry commander. He's the most successful Confederate general in the western part of the Civil War. And when I say west, I don't mean the far west. I mean like Arkansas, Tennessee, the western part of the Confederacy. He once said that the key to his success was to get there firstest with the mostest. Now, he denied that he actually said that, which sounds like it's really bad grammar. But in fact, he was not educated. He had no education to speak of. And he was a slave trader at the outset of the war and just signed up for the militia. And this guy had such a powerful presence that they put him in charge of a brigade. And he was so talented and effective that he rose up. There's an amazing story, and I'll botch it a little bit, I think, but at the Battle of Shiloh, one of the biggest battles in the first couple of years of the war, he's riding around and he got separated from the rest of his command. And he was being cornered by a bunch of Union soldiers that were grabbing him, or shooting at him and grabbing him. He had a saber, and he shot one guy and sabered another. And one of the soldiers that he shot, he grabbed. He's really strong. He grabbed him and pulled him up and flung him on his horse behind his back, and used that guy as a shield as he rode off the battlefield with people shooting at him. And when he got to relative safely, he just shoved the guy off the horse. That sounds like it's out of a movie, but it really happened. There are witnesses that saw that happen. After the war, this guy is one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan. And the darkest aspect to his time in the Civil War is that he was a participant in an infamous thing called the Fort Pillow Massacre. Now, this is where there were some black Union troops, and Southerners vowed that if they ever caught blacks fighting against them, they would be executed. That didn't really happen much. They didn't follow through on that, but this is one time when they did. They captured African American soldiers that he had possession of. A lot of them were shot. So that's Nathan Bedford Forrest. Okay, there you go. Colorful members of the Civil War. There are so many others, but we don't have time to address them all. We'll meet a few more people as we go through some other parts of the Civil War, but these are some of the most outstanding, famous, really famous leaders of the American Civil War. All right, thanks.